The story begins in 1904 when a woman named Sabrina Spielin arrives at the Burgosli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich. She turned out to be suffering from severe hysteria which caused an overwhelming range of emotions. Upon entering her building, Sabina started screaming and yelling at others to stop, but her staff held her and eventually brought her indoors. The next day, a well-known psychiatrist named Carl Jung enters the treatment room and introduces himself to Sabina. Soon, Sabina angrily shouted at him. She said she was fine and she didn't need his help. Carl, on the other hand, gently says that in this case, he just wants to talk to her. He then sat behind Sabina and asked about her condition. When her curls asked what makes her hysterical, Sabina replied that she breaks into a cold sweat whenever she feels humiliated. Her subject then shifts to Sabina's childhood and she explains that her father was irritable with her and frequently beat her since she was 4 years old. Later, at his home, Carl discusses Sabina's unusual case with his pregnant wife Emma. He says he wants psychoanalytic therapy to figure out the cause of Sabina's mental state. It is based on Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory, but has not yet been tested by anyone. So Carl decided to test his own hypothesis and treatment on Sabina to see if it worked. Days have passed and Carl's session has had no noticeable effect on Sabina's condition. One day, while they are walking in the garden, Sabina confesses that her mother does not love her father because an angel told her so. In addition, Sabina admitted to hearing a voice in her head that said, "I will never be a doctor." However, Carl advises her to abandon her thoughts. He then tells her lady that she has to serve in the military for a few weeks. When Sabina hears this, she becomes angry and cries that such a treatment is a waste of time. She then acts erratically while throwing her coat. Carl tried to calm her down, took her coat and began to dust her with a stick. When Sabina sees this, she gets even more angry, grabs her coat and leaves. The next day Sabina ate nothing, frustrating her caregiver. Her nurse tries to persuade her, but her situation becomes difficult and she calls her doctor. Broiler rushes to her room to check on Sabina. A nurse accompanies him, but there is no one in the room. Meanwhile, the 3 staff members struggle to control Sabina outside the laboratory. She is swimming around in a dirty pond and she won't get out of it. Then Broiler comes in and she asks Sabina if she has any hobbies to keep her busy and she says she wants to end her life. She also told her doctor that she never wanted to see Carl again. The crew then drags Sabina out of the pond and takes her to the bathroom against her will. The nurses had her cleaned in the bathtub, after which she finally calmed down. A few days later, Carl returned to the facility and said he wanted to hire Sabina as her assistant and researcher. Sabina also wanted to become a psychiatrist in the future, so she was overjoyed when she heard the story. She then actively participates in Carl's research activities. Sabina is now focused on her work and she seems relaxed. One day Carl invites his wife Emma to his study and after the session asks Sabina what she thinks of Emma. After thinking about it for a while, Sabina said she was worried that Emma was worried about the baby and that her husband was no longer feeling affection for her. Carl is surprised to hear about it from her, plus Sabina comes to her conclusion that Emma is his wife. But Carl tries to pretend he's wrong. In the next scene Emma gave birth to a baby girl and Carl was happy. However, seeing this, Emma apologizes to her husband for not having a son. Carl and Sabina then continue their session, and he finds out that her father's beating on her made her agitated and eventually turned into a sadist. Then she looked for ways to humble herself and bring her joy. So when Carl hit her coat with a stick, she screamed in excitement. The scene then shifts to 2 years after her. Carl and Emma visit Vienna to see the eminent neurologist Sigmund Freud. Carl tells them about Sabina's condition and insights he got from Freud's psychoanalytic theory. He also explained that Sabina is doing very well now and is also enrolled in a medical program. Carl tells Freud that her deep-seated trauma is causing her morbid sexual tendencies, which Freud says is common in his patients. When he returns to Switzerland, Carl meets Sabina and tells her about his encounter with Freud. He argues that they have different views on how to approach this new discovery and whether it will help. According to Carl, Freud was a very stubborn person who believed only in his own opinion and was not persuaded by anyone. Sabina, on the other hand, believes Freud is right and her case proves it. They then discuss Sabina being the best student in medical school. Sabina says she wants to become a good psychiatrist and help others find their freedom. Carl promises that she will one day become a psychiatrist, but Sabina doesn't believe her. A few days later Freud wrote to Carl asking him to take care of his patient Otto Gross, who was himself an excellent doctor. He also said that Carl Otto is a very dangerous person and should not be released and should be treated with extreme caution. When Otto arrives, Karl sits down with Otto for a session, discussing his health and doubts about monogamous marriage. Otto says he is free to have sexual relations with his patients because he believes it makes them feel more open and free. Otto also tries to persuade Karl to sleep with one of his patients, but Karl refuses, claiming it is wrong. The next day, Karl meets with Sabina and reveals that she is starting to have feelings for him, saying she is a virgin. Sabina believes that her intimacy will inevitably come with punishment because of her father's actions. But she wanted to try Karl and she kissed him out of the blue. To her surprise, Karl also reveals that he has her affection for her. However, since he is married, he urged her to keep her cool as it could jeopardize her working relationship. After that, Karl consults with Otto about Sabina's activities, and Otto takes the initiative to encourage him to sleep with her. Karl, on the other hand, insists that it is wrong and that she does not want to take advantage of her vulnerability. The next day, Otto met one of the facility's nurses. After indulging in pleasure, he climbs a wall and escapes from the mental hospital. Later, when Karl arrived at Otto's room, it was empty. Despite living his best life, Otto left a message asking him to tell his father that he had passed away. He also thanks Karl for everything and encourages him not to suppress his impulses. Karl, inspired by Otto's words, enters Sabina's room and the two become close. In the next scene, Karl comes home and Emma tells him that he has a surprise, shows him the yacht, and his heart warms. At this point, Karl decides to end his relationship with Sabina because he is married to Emma, but Sabina disagrees and continues to seduce him. Karl also gives in to her sexual desires and even helps satisfy her fantasies of sexual punishment by beating her up like her father used to do. A few days later, when he got home, he found that Emma had finally given birth to a baby boy. Emma believes her husband will be with her in the end and she is happy, but Karl continues her affair with Sabina. A few months later, Karl meets Freud again, and she admits Freud made a mistake in sending Otto to see her. Karl, meanwhile, assures Freud that she is glad it helped her to be sure of her own decision. That night, the two psychiatrists argue because Karl believes psychoanalysis should have more than just a sexual side. He tries to convince Freud that there is no such thing as chance, but Freud replies that their work is so delicate that it can only be studied scientifically. A few days later, while on a voyage, Freud tells Karl that there are rumors that he has slept with one of his patients, but Karl denies this, of course. After this exchange, Karl realizes he cannot continue this relationship and tells Sabina that he cannot be any more intimate. He wants normal doctor-patient interaction to resume, but Sabina is angry because she has feelings for him. Later, at her home, Emma confronts Karl about the matter, but Karl denies her accusation. Still, Emma says she has no intention of giving up without a fight. A few days later, Sabina comes into Karl's office and she quarrels with him after Karl exposes his affair with her mother. Karl claims he already knew about the incident from an anonymous letter his mother received. He also tells Sabina that from now on he is her doctor and she is his patient. However, upon hearing this, Sabina becomes enraged, cuts her face with a knife, and leaves in a rage. Sabina writes to Freud and asks to meet with him about a problem close to their hearts. After reading her letter, Freud writes her a letter to Karl asking if she knows anything about her. In response, Karl states that Sabina brought them together and pleads with Freud to intervene to prevent her misfortune. Freud then sent a letter to Sabina expressing her belief that although she and Karl were once close, she is no longer together. He told Sabina that the matter must be resolved between themselves without her outside help. After reading this letter, Sabina visits Karl's office and learns that he will be discharged. She accuses Freud of persuading him that she was lying about their affair, and demands that Freud write a letter telling him the whole truth about their affair. Furthermore, Sabina threatens to have the power to destroy Karl, but she chooses not to do it. Having no other choice, Karl ends up writing a letter to Freud claiming that everything Sabina said was true. A few days later we see Karl and Freud boarding a ship bound for America. At night, they discuss Karl's strange dream and their respective interpretations of it. However, Freud was reluctant to reveal his dream to Karl because he did not want to jeopardize his authority. The scene then shifts to years later when Sabina visits Karl to work on her thesis. She announces that when she graduates, she will leave Zurich and move to Vienna. Karl sobs upon hearing this, begging him not to leave, but Sabina has already made up her mind. 2 years later, Sabina graduated as a psychiatrist and met Freud in Vienna. They talk about psychoanalysis and usually agree with Freud and Karl, but think Freud and Karl should get along if psychoanalysis is to move forward. But Freud is not interested in making amends. He sidestepped her topic and asked her if she could take care of her patient, to her surprise. Freud then visits Karl's office to change her relationship, but the meeting fails due to Karl's involvement with Sabina and his immorality in Switzerland. Freud is forced to break their friendship. Over the next few days they exchange letters as rivals rather than friends and colleagues, and eventually part ways, each beginning to doubt the other's sincerity and banishing the other from their lives. Years later, a married and pregnant Sabina visits Karl and Emma. Emma tells her that she has struggled with her mental illness since her husband cut off her relationship with Freud. Sabina then sits with Karl by the river and tries to talk to him. Karl admits he can't sleep because of apocalyptic dreams of being washed away in a flood. She then asks about his new lover, and Karl replies that she resembles Sabina, reminding him of her time together. Furthermore, he admits to Sabina that he regrets being expelled from Vienna by the Nazis. Sabina, on the other hand, had taught many analysts in Russia before she and her two daughters were murdered by the Nazis in 1942. Karl recovered from a nervous breakdown and became one of the world's leading psychologists until his death in 1961. End. Conclusion: in a web of intricate relationships and psychological exploration, the lives of Sabina, Carl Jung, and Sigmund Freud intersected and diverged, ultimately revealing the complexities of human desires, vulnerabilities, and the enduring impact of their pioneering work on the evolution of psychoanalysis. As their paths intertwined and clashed, their shared pursuit of understanding the human mind unfolded against the backdrop of personal struggles, illuminating the lasting legacies and individual fates that shaped the landscape of psychological thought and practice.